Kigali today feels like the future, polished, peaceful, full of promise. But rewind just 3 decades, and this land was soaked in blood. Imagine waking up to find your neighbor, the one who used to borrow sugar, now wielding a machete, calling you a cockroach. Not because of something you did, but because of who you were born to be. In just 100 days, nearly 1 million people were butchered, hacked, burned, beaten to death, in one of the most efficient genocides the world has ever seen. But here's the part history class leaves out. The killing didn't end in 1994. It metastasized, spilling across borders, igniting the deadliest war on African soil, and fueling a shadow economy of minerals, militias, and silence. This is the story of the Rwandan Genocide, of how colonialism planted the seed, how propaganda poured the gasoline, and how the fire that started in Rwanda set an entire region ablaze. Before genocide became Rwanda's headline, it was a land of deep tradition and fluid identity. A kingdom of clans bound not by race, but by custom. Here, 3 groups lived side by side: the Hutu, the Tutsi, and the Twa. But these weren't rigid tribes. They spoke the same language. They shared the same religion. They intermarried. And they weren't divided by blood, but by cattle. These were generally wealthier cattle herders. Hutus, mostly farmers. The Twa, a much smaller group, were forest-dwelling hunter-gatherers. But the line between Hutu and Tutsi wasn't fixed. You could become Tutsi by acquiring cattle and rising in status. You could lose that status just as quickly. The system wasn't perfect, but it worked. It was local, organic, centered around the Mwami, the king, who governed with a mix of ritual, respect, and centralized authority. In 1897, Germany claimed Rwanda as part of its East African Empire. But unlike in some other colonies, the Germans ruled lightly here. They didn't try to erase the monarchy. Instead, they co-opted it. They leaned on the Tutsi elites to collect taxes and keep the peace. They saw the tall, cattle-owning Tutsis as natural aristocrats, more noble in appearance, more European. That bias, barely acknowledged at the time, quietly amplified a social divide that had never truly been tribal. The Germans didn't invent Rwanda's hierarchies, but they did start to weaponize them. World War I changed everything. The Germans were defeated, and Rwanda, along with neighboring Burundi, was handed to Belgium under a League of Nations mandate. But where the Germans had been hands-off, the Belgians took a scalpel to Rwandan society and carved it along racial lines. Fueled by scientific racism, Belgian officials and Catholic missionaries believed the Tutsis were racially superior, descendants of a lost Ethiopian or even Hamitic race. Absurd? Yes, but devastating in its consequences. In 1933, the Belgians did something Rwanda had never seen before. They conducted an ethnic census. Every Rwandan was issued an identity card, branding them permanently as Hutu, Tutsi, or Twa. No more flexibility, no more social mobility. Your identity was now official, and it was inescapable. It may seem small, just a piece of paper, but that ID card would one day become a death sentence. The Belgians backed the Tutsi elite for decades, placing them in charge of schools, churches, and civil administration. They built a system of inequality with a European stamp of approval. The Hutu majority, meanwhile, was left behind, politically sidelined and economically resentful. For years, that tension simmered, and then, finally, it exploded. In 1957, 9 Hutu intellectuals published the Bahutu Manifesto, a searing indictment of Tutsi privilege. It was the first political document to frame Rwanda's social inequality in purely ethnic terms. The manifesto didn't just demand reform, it demanded a reversal. And when the Belgians, sensing winds of change, began loosening their grip in the late 1950s, they didn't back the monarchy or the Tutsi aristocracy. They backed the Hutu majority. On November 1st, 1959, a Hutu sub-chief was attacked, allegedly by Tutsi royalists. In retaliation, Hutu mobs swept through towns and villages, killing Tutsis, burning homes, and targeting anyone tied to the old regime. It marked the beginning of the Rwandan Revolution. By 1961, the monarchy was abolished. Rwanda declared itself a republic, ruled by Hutu leaders, and over 150,000 Tutsis had fled the country, scattering across Uganda, Tanzania, Burundi, and Zaire. Among them, a small, observant boy who would never forget what he saw. That boy was Paul Kagame. He grew up in dusty refugee camps, stateless, voiceless, marked by an identity that made him a target. In exile, Kagame didn't just stew in memory, he learned to fight. In the 1980s, he joined Uganda's rebel forces under Yoweri Museveni, learning guerrilla tactics, discipline, and strategy. For Kagame and thousands of other exiles, Rwanda was still home. And one day, they would return. Let's be clear. The hatred that fueled Rwanda's genocide wasn't ancient. It wasn't tribal. It was engineered by colonial systems that reduced a dynamic society to boxes on a form. The Belgians created the hierarchy. The identity cards locked it in place. The post-independence governments built on the foundation of fear and revenge. By the 1990s, the fuse had already been lit, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the powder keg. By the late 1980s, the exiled sons and daughters of Rwanda had waited long enough. They had grown up in refugee camps in Uganda, Tanzania, Congo, without a country, without a future, and without a voice. But they hadn't forgotten where they came from, and they hadn't forgiven what drove them out. Among them was a soft-spoken, sharp-eyed man named Paul Kagame. As a child, he'd watched his family flee across the border. As a teenager, he lived without citizenship. But by his 30s, he was no longer a refugee. He was a soldier, trained in guerrilla warfare and ready to return. In 1987, a group of exiled Rwandan intellectuals and fighters founded the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. They came out of RANU, a political pressure group. But this new formation wasn't about words, it was about action. They trained under Uganda's rising leader, Yoweri Museveni, whose own rebellion had just toppled a dictatorship. Kagame, quiet but meticulous, would become head of intelligence. These weren't mercenaries. These were men and women on a mission: return to Rwanda, reclaim dignity, rewrite history. By 1990, they were ready. Back in Rwanda, President Juvénal Habyarimana ruled like a king in all but name. He had seized power in 1973, promising peace. What he built instead was a one-party system, the MRND, the only political game in town. Loyalty wasn't optional, it was survival. Ethnic quotas barred Tutsis from universities, civil service jobs, even public housing. Files were marked Hutu only. Ambition was suspicion, and suspicion got you followed, or worse. But behind the curtain of order, something darker was brewing. A hardline movement called Hutu Power began to take root. Quiet at first, then louder, then armed. October 1st, 1990, just before dawn, 4,000 RPF fighters crossed the Ugandan border into northern Rwanda. Their goal wasn't conquest, it was leverage. They wanted talks. They wanted safe return for refugees. They wanted political reform. But the regime in Kigali didn't see rebels. It saw invaders. Habyarimana's elite presidential guard, backed by Zairian reinforcements and French military advisors, launched a brutal counterattack. The RPF was pushed back into the mountains, retreating deep into the Virunga forests. But they didn't disappear. They re-emerged as guerrilla fighters, striking convoys, disrupting supply lines, moving like shadows. The civil war had begun, and it would last for almost 4 years. As the RPF gained ground in the north, something insidious was metastasizing in the capital. A private radio station, RTLM, began broadcasting in 1993. It played pop music and comedy, but between the laughs were venomous calls to violence. Tutsis were cockroaches, Inyenzi, infiltrators, subhuman. It wasn't just talk. Militias like the Interahamwe and Impuzamugambi trained in open daylight, sharpening machetes, memorizing kill lists, and rehearsing the day the signal would come. This wasn't just political division. This was incitement with a timeline. In 1993, under international pressure, the Rwandan government and the RPF signed the Arusha Accords, a fragile peace deal meant to end the civil war. It promised a transitional government, power sharing, and reintegration of exiled Tutsis. UN peacekeepers arrived under the command of General Romeo Dallaire, a Canadian officer who believed in the mission. But behind the handshakes, the extremists were plotting. They saw Arusha as surrender. They began stockpiling weapons. They organized roadblocks. They trained militias by night. And quietly, they prepared for what they called the final solution. January 1994. A man known only as Jean-Pierre approached Dallaire's staff. He was a militia insider, and he had a warning. There were lists, thousands of names, plans for mass killings. The militias were preparing to exterminate every Tutsi in Kigali. He even told Dallaire where the arms were hidden. Dallaire faxed UN headquarters in New York. He begged for permission to seize the weapons and stop the massacre before it began. The response? Stand down. Do not intervene. The red flags were waving. The world chose to blink. On the evening of April 6, 1994, President Habyarimana boarded his plane to return from peace talks in Tanzania. As the Dassault Falcon descended toward Kigali Airport, 2 surface-to-air missiles struck. The jet exploded mid-air and crashed in a fireball that lit the horizon. Everyone on board was killed. Habyarimana, Burundi's President Ntare Amira, their staff, and crew. Within minutes, Kigali descended into panic. The Presidential Guard issued a coded message over military channels. The commander is dead. It wasn't just a report. It was a green light. Militia units mobilized. Roadblocks went up. Kill lists were activated. Kigali was about to become a slaughterhouse. To this day, the identity of the shooters remains a mystery. One cloaked in conspiracy and political agendas. Some say Hutu hardliners, angry at Habyarimana's concessions, orchestrated the hit themselves to justify mass extermination. Others point to the RPF, claiming they sabotaged the plane to derail the peace deal and return to power by force. Multiple investigations have led to conflicting conclusions. But here's what is clear. The crash didn't cause the genocide. It triggered a plan that had already been written, rehearsed, and armed. Within hours of the explosion, the first victims fell. Prime Minister Agatha Uwilingiyimana, one of the few moderates in Habyarimana's circle, was murdered. 10 Belgian UN peacekeepers sent to guard her were also killed, tortured, mutilated, executed. And with that, the UN mission collapsed. The international community recoiled, and Rwanda was left to bleed. What had begun as a civil war had now mutated into something else. The genocide had begun. By April 7th, Rwanda was no longer a country. It was a killing field. In a matter of hours, Kigali transformed into a city of roadblocks, machetes, and death lists. Tutsis were dragged from their homes, lined up, and slaughtered, sometimes by soldiers, sometimes by the people they knew best. Neighbors, co-workers, even classmates. What triggered it was political. What followed was extermination. This wasn't a sudden burst of chaos. It was a blueprint, activated with chilling precision. The Rwandan government didn't collapse in the chaos. It led it. Ministers gave orders. Mayors coordinated attacks. Police handed out weapons, guns, grenades, and above all, machetes. Massacres were organized like public works projects. Killers were paid in beer, food, and loot, or worse, told it was their patriotic duty. Refuse, and you risked being labeled a traitor or a Tutsi in disguise. Churches once seen as sanctuaries became traps. Priests locked the doors, militias lit the matches, hospitals, schools, and even Red Cross stations. No place was off limits. Sexual assault wasn't just a side effect of war, it was a strategy. Tens of thousands of women were sexually assaulted, tortured, and mutilated, not in secrecy, but often in public as terror and humiliation. Many were deliberately infected with HIV by soldiers who had been ordered to kill slowly. Others were forced into sexual slavery by militia leaders who treated them as war trophies. Mothers were made to witness the horrors inflicted on their daughters. Entire generations were scarred, not just in body, but in soul. Even in a genocide that redefined brutality, the use of sexual assault was something almost unspeakable. The world saw, the world knew, the world did nothing. UN peacekeepers, led by General Romeo Dallaire, were still in Rwanda. But their mandate was weak. They weren't allowed to engage. When they tried to protect civilians, they were told to stand down. When 10 Belgian peacekeepers were murdered in the early days, Belgium pulled out. The US, still haunted by its failure in Somalia, refused to even call it a genocide, because doing so would have triggered legal obligations to act. So the diplomats debated language while Rwandans died by the minute. The UN reduced its troops from 2,500 to just 270 at the height of the massacre. 270 peacekeepers against tens of thousands of killers. With the world standing by, only one force moved to stop the genocide. The Rwandan Patriotic Front, led by Paul Kagame, launched a series of coordinated offensives across the country, starting in the north, then the east, then westward toward Kigali. They didn't rely on shock and awe. They advanced carefully, securing one town at a time, dismantling roadblocks and liberating survivors. What they found along the way was worse than even they had imagined. Churches packed with bodies, mass graves so full the earth itself had split open. Entire families wiped out, generation after generation, gone in a single morning. In late June 1994, France, under growing international pressure, launched Operation Turquoise, declaring it a humanitarian mission. They carved out a safe zone in the southwest. Some civilians were rescued, lives were saved, but many Rwandans, including Kagame, saw it for what it also was, a cover, a way for France to protect its former allies in Habyarimana's regime, a corridor for Interahamwe leaders and former soldiers to escape into Zaire, taking weapons, cash, and plans for revenge with them. The operation that was meant to end the genocide may have only moved it next door. On July 4th, after 3 months of slaughter, the RPF took control of Kigali. The genocidal regime crumbled. The roadblocks were dismantled. The killing, finally, began to slow. But by then, it was too late for 800,000 to 1 million souls. The countryside was littered with bones, rivers ran red, entire towns had no living children, whole bloodlines had been erased. The genocide had ended, but Rwanda was unrecognizable. This wasn't just a failure of humanity, it was a failure of policy, of institutions, of courage. The world had been warned, the signs were everywhere, the messages were clear, but the risks seemed too high, the words too difficult, the people too far away. And so, Rwanda burned, while the world watched through the comfort of distant TV screens. For those who survived, the pain didn't end with the silence of the guns. It continued in the nightmares, the missing faces, and the ache of a future stolen. But the fire was still burning. It had just crossed the border. The killing stopped in Rwanda, but the killers didn't. In the chaos following the genocide, nearly 2 million people, mostly Hutus, flooded across the border into Zaire, now known as the Democratic Republic of Congo. Among them were not just civilians, but the very architects of the genocide. Interahamwe militiamen, former soldiers of the Rwandan armed forces, and hardline politicians, the genocidaires, used the cover of humanitarian crisis to regroup. They took over the refugee camps, they hijacked aid deliveries, and they began preparing for round two. Back in Kigali, Paul Kagame, now vice president and de facto leader of Rwanda, watched the threat grow. The killers hadn't just escaped justice. They were rearming. They were launching raids into Rwanda. Civilians were dying. Kagame made a choice. He wouldn't wait to be attacked again. In 1996, Kagame and Museveni authorized a cross-border invasion. The goal? Dismantle the refugee camps, neutralize the militias, eliminate the threat once and for all. But what began as a security operation quickly became something else entirely. The Rwandan military, backed by Uganda, didn't just destroy the camps. They went further. They marched hundreds of kilometers into Zaire, smashing through the crumbling army of Mobutu Sese Seko, the aging dictator who had ruled for over 30 years. Their local proxy was a little-known rebel leader named Laurent Désiré Kabila. With Rwandan weapons, soldiers, and strategy, Kabila captured Kinshasa in 1997. Mobutu fled into exile. Kabila became president, and Rwanda, it now had deep leverage over the most resource-rich country in the world. But it didn't stop there. Eastern Congo wasn't just a refuge for fugitives. It was a gold mine, literally. The region holds massive deposits of gold, tin, tungsten, and coltan, a mineral critical for smartphones, laptops, and satellites. And whoever controlled those minerals controlled untold wealth. Rwandan and Ugandan troops, still stationed in Congo, partnered with local militias to take control of mining operations. They smuggled minerals through Rwandan and Ugandan borders, sold them on the global market, and used the profits to fuel their military and political machines. Phones buzzed in Paris, New York, and Beijing, powered by blood-soaked minerals from a war nobody wanted to talk about. But Kagame and Kabila's alliance was built on convenience, not trust. Once in power, Kabila turned on his backers, demanding that all foreign troops leave Congo. Kagame refused, and just like that, war erupted again. This time, it was Rwanda and Uganda on one side, backing a new wave of rebel groups. On the other, Kabila's government, supported by a coalition of African nations, Angola, Zimbabwe, Namibia, and others. It became the Second Congo War, a conflict so vast, so complex, and so devastating, it would later be called Africa's World War. From 1998 to 2003, Eastern Congo became hell on earth. Over 5 million people died, mostly from starvation, disease, and displacement. Thousands were executed, women were sexually assaulted, children were conscripted into militias. Villages were erased from maps, and through it all, the minerals kept moving. Coltan for your phone, gold for your jewelry, tin for your circuit boards. This wasn't just a war, it was a business model, and Rwanda, hailed for its post-genocide recovery, was at the center of it. Paul Kagame rebuilt Rwanda. He stopped the genocide. He brought order and growth. But across the border, his legacy is darker. Multiple UN investigations accused Rwandan forces of committing war crimes in Congo, including massacres of civilians, executions of prisoners, and targeted assassinations of Hutu refugees, including women and children. Yes, some genocidaires were killed, but so were countless innocents, people who had nothing to do with the genocide, caught in the crossfire of revenge, profit, and control. To this day, Eastern Congo remains fractured, its hills patrolled by militias, its mines exploited, its people forgotten. The Rwandan Genocide ended in July 1994, but the fire it started still burns. Deep in the jungles of Congo, where proxy wars continue, where rebel groups change names but never goals, where life is cheap and minerals are priceless. We like to draw lines in history. Before, after, never again. But in Central Africa, there was no clean break, no catharsis, no closure, just silence and blood and profit. The genocide was the match, Congo was the fuel, and the world, the silent witness. Today, Rwanda is a case study in transformation. From the ashes of genocide, it rebuilt itself into what some call the Singapore of Africa. Clean streets, high-speed internet, efficient government. GDP growth averaging 7 to 8% a year. Rwanda is now a darling of investors, aid donors, and Western diplomats. But behind the statistics and the skyscrapers lies a quieter question. Who paid for this miracle? Rwanda's peace came at a price, and that price was political silence. President Paul Kagame, once the rebel commander who stopped the genocide, has ruled with an iron grip since 2000. Elections are held, but always with a foregone conclusion. Opposition leaders are jailed, exiled, or mysteriously found dead. Human rights groups are monitored. Critical journalists like Jean Leonard Rugambage gunned down near their homes. Artists like Kizito Mihigo arrested, later unalived himself in police custody. Kagame's Rwanda is safe, efficient, and booming, but only if you stay in line. After the genocide, the world demanded justice. Rwanda responded with two systems. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, or ICTR, was set up in Arusha, Tanzania. It tried senior leaders of the genocide. Over 13 years, it convicted just 61 people, at a cost of nearly $1 billion. Meanwhile, inside Rwanda, justice looked very different. Locals gathered under trees, in courtyards, on dusty schoolyards. These were the Gacaca courts, community-run tribunals designed for speed and participation. Over 1.2 million cases were heard. Thousands of perpetrators confessed. Survivors confronted their attackers face to face. But Gacaca had flaws. No defense lawyers, no appeals, plenty of false accusations. For some, it brought closure. For others, it reopened wounds. While Rwanda was praised for its post-genocide recovery, few wanted to talk about where much of its wealth came from. According to UN reports, the Rwandan military and its allies profited from vast quantities of gold, tin, tungsten, and coltan smuggled out of eastern Congo during and after the war. Rwanda officially has no coltan mines, yet for years it was one of the top coltan exporters in the world. How? By routing minerals looted from Congolese conflict zones through its own export systems. Western tech companies bought the raw materials, often through shadowy middlemen, without asking too many questions. Your phone, your laptop, your watch. They may have been powered by suffering you'll never see. The cost of Rwanda's regional dominance was paid by Congo's civilians. Between 1998 and 2007, an estimated 5 million people died from war-related causes, many of them not from bullets, but from starvation, disease, and displacement. Sexual assault was used as a weapon. Girls as young as 7 were targeted. Women were mutilated. Entire communities were torn apart. And yet, no international tribunal, no global outcry, no justice. The genocide was rightfully condemned. The war that followed was quietly ignored. In Rwanda, survivors still live with the trauma of genocide. Many lost entire families. Many are widows or orphans. Even today, over 60% of households in some areas are female-led due to genocide losses. NGOs help, but many survivors rely on monthly stipends or foreign aid. Others still live near the men who once tried to kill them. Reconciliation programs exist, but they rarely acknowledge Hutu civilians killed during RPF reprisals, or the victims in Congo who remain uncounted. The narrative of never again is powerful, but it's not the whole story. Today's Rwanda is a magnet for global capital. Chinese firms build highways. European NGOs run coffee cooperatives. American investors eye Kigali's tech parks. And Kagame. He's seen as a visionary, welcomed at Davos, praised by Tony Blair, studied in Harvard classrooms. But while the elite thrive, inequality persists. A significant portion of the population still lives below the poverty line. And in Congo, minerals still flow out under armed guard, feeding devices and dividends across the globe. For some, Rwanda's recovery is a success story. For others, it's a story of selective memory. Rwanda stands at a crossroads. It can continue down the path of tight control, growth without dissent, peace without truth. Or it can open up, confront uncomfortable legacies, and strive for justice beyond its borders. Because the choices it makes now won't just shape Rwanda's future, they'll shape the future of the entire Great Lakes region, from the vast lands of Congo to the halls of the United Nations. The guns may have fallen silent in Kigali, but in eastern Congo, they never really stopped. To this day, the region is home to over 100 armed groups, some fighting for land, others for minerals, and many backed by foreign interests. One of the most active, the M23 rebels, accused of massacres, displacements, and looting. The UN has repeatedly linked their backing to Rwanda, despite Kigali's denials. It's a shadow war, fought far from headlines. But for those on the ground, the consequences are very real, and Rwanda's fingerprints still linger. Even now, the minerals fueling this hidden conflict are embedded in our lives. Coltan, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, the backbone of the digital age, still leave Congo through unofficial routes, often labeled as Rwandan exports. Global companies issue statements. They promise ethical sourcing. But audits are rare, oversight is murky, and the money keeps flowing. This isn't just a local issue, it's a global supply chain built on silence. Inside Rwanda, history is a careful script. The genocide is taught, memorialized, honored, but not everything can be said. Criticizing the RPF is taboo. Discussing revenge killings by Kagame's forces, dangerous. Asking about Congo, often met with silence or suspicion. The government promotes national unity, banning references to ethnic identity. But survivors know the scars don't vanish just because you stop naming them. And for young Rwandans born after 1994, the truth comes with heavy redactions. History isn't just what happened, it's what we choose to remember and what we choose to erase. In Rwanda, memory is sacred, but also guarded. In Congo, suffering continues, but barely spoken of. And in the rest of the world, we celebrate recovery without fully facing the wreckage it left in its wake. If we forget the connections, the profiteering, the silence, we risk letting it all happen again, somewhere else, with different names, but the same formula. The story isn't over, and neither is our responsibility. I hope you found the story of the Rwandan Genocide interesting, but if you want an even more controversial piece of African history, go check out this video right here. I'll see you there in a second.